We're going to begin this week by talking about A Birth of a Nation. We'll just be watching clips, but the whole film is available for you to see. I'm not requiring that you watch the whole thing for a few reasons. The first is that it's very long. It's about 3.5 hours, and this is a long movie for us to watch. But you can imagine how long it felt for people of its day who had grown up on short films. The major reason, however, that I'm not requiring that you watch this film is that while it's a very famous film and ensconced in the history of film studies, it's also a very racist film. It's historically important for technical and formal innovations, but it's also historically important for how it directly affected race relations in the United States. So it is both an example of really dramatic innovations in artistry, and at the same time, it serves as a prime example of how film was becoming a medium that changed whole populations, that could affect them, that could sway their politics, and often to ends that we might not be very proud of at this point in time, and that are troubling within their own moment as well. Birth of a Nation is a controversial film that's important to talk about because it demonstrates just what a profound impact this new artistic medium would have on politics and the everyday lives of people in this country who are hit by a new wave of intensified racism. We're going to discuss the film and its formal innovations, which are impressive, but they're done in the service of a very poisonous plot and politics. So we'll see how Griffith works hard to have you identify with the heroes of the film who are, in fact, alive with the KKK. And we're going to get into how this all plays out historically and politically. So we'll be watching a few clips within these lectures, but I invite you to watch the full film should you wish to. As I just mentioned, D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation from 1915 is a historically very important film. Not only does it make monumental stylistic innovations in terms of cinematography, editing, and storyline, it changed what movies were and what they could be in terms of how complex those narratives could be, in terms of the length that they could go on, and the sensationalism that they could create. And he shows us the power and the dangers of a mass medium. Because of its realism in terms of how it's shot, and even documentary qualities that he puts into the film, and Griffith's constant citation, as we'll see, of historical sources as he makes not just a narrative but an argument, that this is, he tries to convince the viewers that this is actually true and wants to sway the feelings of his audience and their morals. And he was rather effective in this project. And we're going to talk about how the film played out in national politics at the time and the way in which he constructs his narrative in very particular ways to convince his viewers of not just the righteousness of his story, but that this is all grounded in fact, when in fact it's quite manipulated and twisted from reality. We're going to bracket these political issues for just a little bit. We're going to get to it in a few videos' time, but we're going to come back to it and think about how this film impacted artistry at the time as well as politics. I'm showing you here a poster advertising Griffith's film, as well as a series of facts and stats about it. You can see from the poster that there's a lot of showmanship and salesmanship happening here, calling it the eighth wonder of the world, naming how much it costs to make and how many actors and how many animals were used in this film. We can see from those statistics that it's a very long film. It was 4 to 5 times longer than the average film at the time, and it cost a huge amount to make. The poster is exaggerating slightly, but his next film would also cost an enormous amount, over $1.4 million. The initial budget for the film, though, was already high, which was about $40,000. This was also an expensive film to see. It cost more than a regular movie ticket price. It was about $40 equivalent at the time. So a major investment if you're going to go and watch this film, and pretty cost prohibitive. It had a high ticket price because of how much it took to make the film. But no doubt you noticed, if you watched any of the film, that this is much more complex than the others we've watched so far. There are many sets, many homes, battle scenes, an outrageous number of characters and extras, including all of those animals and horses that are in the scenes, and elaborate costumes as well. The film earned millions of dollars. It was considered the most popular movie of the time, and that means in terms of how many tickets it sold, not in terms of people thinking it was their favorite movie, though, of course, many people were swept up in it. It was also a widely protested film. You can imagine from what I've told you about the plot and what you can see on your own in watching the film, that it inflamed a lot of political debate and passions, and was a real tinderbox for American culture at the time. And in addition to all of these things, it was considered the most technologically sophisticated film of its time. Griffith was making huge innovations in filmmaking in this movie, and all of that was quite dazzling to audiences at the time, and in many ways still holds up, especially as we're watching chronologically in this history of filmmaking. Other notable historical and cultural facts I want to point out here is that it was screened at the White House by President Woodrow Wilson, who was friends with the author of the book on which this film is based, and implicitly endorsed by the White House. Wilson also comes up as a figure in the film in that he's quoted sympathetically by Griffith in the film, as we'll talk about, and that this film is often credited with stoking the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan in the United States, which was a group that had dwindled greatly in numbers, and this film, in its glorification of the KKK, resulted in an upsurgence in its membership and its activity. So it had real effects on people's lives and politics and culture in the United States. The director, D.W. Griffith, was born in 1875 in Kentucky, and he cut his teeth as an actor, and then later as a playwright, and then as a master of the short film while working under Porter, the director of The Great Train Robbery, which we watched last time, who was working for Edison. But after a bit of directing experience there, he jumped ship to Edison's biggest competitor, American Mutoscope and Biograph Company. This was during the kinetoscope era. Biograph was churning out hundreds of short films and needed directors to keep up with the pace. These were rapidly made, low-budget films. Griffith literally made hundreds of these films with Biograph, and his production rate allowed for a lot of room for experimentation. So having these kind of cheap throwaway films allowed him to really try new things all the time. And like his mentor, Porter, Griffith's major stylistic innovations were with cinematography, especially composition, and then editing, really embracing that idea of the crosscut or the parallel edit that we saw in The Great Train Robbery. One of the things that he pointed out, too, was that unlike other filmmakers, he started to think of cinema as being something that was completely different from theater, that we weren't going to look at stage sets or scenes one after the other, connected by edits. He started to think about cinema as being made of shots, not scenes, and each scene could be made of many, many shots. This is something that we're going to see happening in Birth of a Nation that we did not see in The Great Train Robbery. We saw those little invisible edits within scenes, but here we're going to have numerous cuts within a single scene, giving us a variety of different shot lengths and really amping up the tension through those kinds of interscene edits, as well as cross-cutting between scenes. He was influenced by both Porter and Méliès and would go on to influence the next generation of filmmakers around the world, which is another reason we still talk about Griffith today, is that his techniques became the fuel for a whole generation of filmmakers, particularly Soviet filmmakers in Russia that we'll talk about in just a few weeks' time. As I was just saying, Griffith was one of the first filmmakers to think of narrative film as something distinctly different from theater. He didn't show us scenes as if they were just stage sets. And that is, everyone wasn't lined up in front of the camera on a single plate of action in an artificial space. Films could organize space and time differently than theater, whether that meant by cutting back and forth fluidly between scenes through cross-cutting, or by moving the spectator closer or further away from the subject of that scene. So rather than shooting everything from the same distance, showing full bodies on sets, Griffith discovered that he could raise narrative tension and more clearly communicate the emotional and narrative content of his plot through shot type. He was one of the first to use close-ups, showing someone's head or head and shoulders, focusing even on one part of their face, highlighting a quivering lip or a certain detail within a scene, like a prop that's going to become significant later. This is now how movies are made, and you wouldn't think twice about being shown a detail in close-up. If the camera cut away to a wedding band on a woman's finger, we would know that her being married is important to what's going to happen. We'd understand that this was significant. There'd be no reason to show us this otherwise unless it was involved in the story. If not, the shot would seem strange and out of place and discordant. But the director is telling us a lot of information with these shots without having to have someone narrate it vocally within the scene. This is all a really long way of saying that Griffith had realized something very important about cinema, which was that the film is composed of shots as their basic semantic unit. It's not scenes. And it was the director, the cinematographer, and the editor who would determine how the audience would see the action, not the screenwriter, not the person who made up the story, but the person who constructs it for the viewer. And each of us in our seats would have the very same view of what was going on, despite where we were sitting in the theater. And this view could be a very curious one, in that our bodies don't seem to stay in the same place. We can jump around in time, move forward or closer, or retreat away from the scene by camera choices in cinematography and in editing. We might see a body from very far away and in the next scene get very close to that person. Or we might see someone's face and then see what that character sees, cutting from a shot of their face to the object they're focused on. This is all really powerful, and it makes watching a film a potentially very different experience than seeing a piece of theater or watching something unfold in real life, where those kinds of changes don't happen unless you're picking a telescope up or binoculars to zoom in on someone. So camera movement can do all of this, and Griffith was a pioneer of the moving camera during the shot. This could mean pans across scenes, whether interior or exterior, or tracking shots following someone as they move in space. So panning shots, which we talked about in the last module, make us feel like we're turning our head side to side. It gives us this sense of embodiment. And tracking shots make it seem as if we're traveling along with the person or the car or the train or whatever is in that scene. So there's a tension here. We're remaining still in our seats in the movie theater, but our point of view and placement within the scene is always changing. We appear to be moving or mobilized in the scene, and this helps us identify with the story, to not feel like it's distant and set back from us, but that we are tied into it and immersed within it. We're given a world through the shot, and we alternately feel embodied or even disembodied by its movements. So all of these techniques are a matter of cinematography, of shot construction, long shots, close-ups, tracking shots, pans. These are stylistic choices that are made about how to record the scene, and they affect our spatial relationship to the things pictured. But Griffith also made a lot of advances in the way that films are edited. And these choices in editing had a great impact on how time and space were understood within the film. Just like Porter, Griffith experimented with how to show things that were happening in two different places at the same time. So he too used cross-cutting. Rather than just following the same character through different sequential scenes, he could show that things were happening side by side and raise the tension, implicating at most times that those two scenes would eventually meet together, that the person pursued and the pursuer will end up in the same frame at some point. And this is something that we read quite naturally. If one cuts between scenes that are not in the same place or don't have the same characters, we get the idea that they're happening at the same time but in different places. Of course, we can be cross-cutting from times as well. We can have flashbacks and things like that that organize space as well. And it's often in terms of flashbacks and flash forwards, it's cues within the mise en scène that'll help us understand what's happening. A character's hair will change or clothing will change. There'll be set differences. We'll see that same character in two different places rather than cutting between two different sets of characters. Before getting into the larger historical significance of Griffith's film and even the details of his own editing, I want us to go over some cinematographical techniques that we can start to identify in Griffith's film as we watch it, and also think about the narrative impact of those techniques.